university circles. Just at this moment he was indulging in his own peculiar brand of academic humour, much to the annoyance of the fair-haired young man who was sitting impatiently on the edge of a chair. "What an original suggestion, my dear Carter," said the Professor. "A monster in Loch Ness. I wonder why no one has thought of it before. And how do you imagine it has survived there for so long? Perhaps it has discovered the secret of eternal youth, or perhaps there is a tribe of monsters there. How delightful! No doubt we scientists have overlooked the simple explanation as to how they got there, or indeed why they put in such infrequent appearances." He paused to puff at his large Bavarian pipe. "What an old fool," thought John Carter angrily, as he eyed the man who had once seemed so receptive to new ideas. "I suppose his Nobel Prize has made him feel infallible." "Look, Professor," said John, "you know me. You were once my tutor. I've always been perfectly sane. It may sound absurd, but I believe in the thing. It won't mean much to you, but a few months ago I visited an old friend in Scotland. Well, he was more than just an old friend. He used to be my guardian when I was a boy, and looked after me till I went to school. He taught me everything that is dear to me now: love of nature, the open air, the countryside. He was the finest man I have ever known. When I last saw him he was dying. He was an old man, but a healthy one. I am convinced that his death was hastened by some kind of shock. And a few nights before he died he told me something I shall never forget." The Professor had ceased to look amused. He was undeniably interested. "It was something he saw one night in Loch Ness, something so terrible that it killed him. He described it to me so vividly and in such detail that I know it was more than a mistake or some hallucination." The Professor lit his pipe again and sucked at it deeply. "What was it your friend described?" he asked. "It was a plesiosaur," said John simply. The Professor's expression did not change. "You realise that the plesiosaur became extinct over 100 million years ago, don't you, Carter?" "Yes, of course," replied John. He was now searching in his briefcase. "Look at this. Here's a sketch I've drawn. It shows how a plesiosaur could survive. You see, it is possible that some kind of cavern could be connected with the loch, a cavern far older than the lake itself. There could even be other creatures down there, relics from the same age." The two men looked at each other. John stood up. "Well, thank you for sparing me your time, Professor. I'm sorry you are not interested in my project. Your knowledge would have been invaluable. I would be grateful if you would not mention this to anyone." Professor Middleton moved round to the door and turned the knob. "Well, thank you for coming, Carter. I promise I won't say a word about it. Oh, by the way, you do me an injustice. I am interested in your project, and what is more, I intend to come with you." It was a freezing January night. Inside the tiny lakeside cottage, John Carter and his 17-year-old brother Alan were making their final preparations. "That's everything then," said John. "Diving gear, lamps, intercom, and a revolver for you. You're a better shot than me. Professor Middleton should be here any minute. Pity we have to choose the night for chosen this spot because this is where my guardian, Robin Mackintosh, saw the plesiosaur. If it did come from some underground cavern, the entrance will probably be somewhere around here. We'll have to investigate the side of the loch most carefully. The entrance may not be at all large. We'll go in 25 yards apart. We'll communicate over the intercom, but don't say anything unless it's worth saying. The four changed silently into the dark blue frogman suits. John could not help smiling at the sight of the professor clambering into his science fiction outfit. When they went to the side of the loch, the waters were black and forbidding. As the other three dispersed to their stations along the edge of the loch, John fastened his helmet and checked his radio, oxygen and the flashlight in his helmet. Then, over the radio, he gave a signal for the four to descend into the depths of Loch Ness. At this point, the loch sloped very steeply and then dropped sheer to the bottom. John's flashlight hardly seemed to penetrate the black, inscrutable water around him as he descended. Down he went, down and down for what seemed an eternity. For the first time he felt frightened. Was he mad? What if there was a monster there? Supposing he came face to face with it? Suddenly he felt something under his feet. It gave beneath him in an unpleasant, rubbery way. He gave an involuntary shudder. Then he smiled to himself. Mud. He had reached the bottom. "Hello, John here," he called over the intercom. "Are we all on the bottom?" "No, still diving," came the reply from all three. Strange, thought John to himself. He must be on some kind of shelf. He groped his way towards the side, expecting at any moment to bump into the sheer face of the loch wall. But nothing happened. He continued to move unimpeded into what he could only think of as being a large opening in the side of the loch. Could this be the entrance to the cavern, thought John? Could he have stumbled on it in his first dive? As he advanced farther, his light seemed feebler than ever. Now no little fishes darted across his path, no weeds floated past. Then he realised that he must be well inside the wall of the loch. He broke the silence over the intercom. "All of you, come immediately to where my light is flashing." He returned to the mouth of the cave. Within 10 minutes, he had been joined by 3 other ghostly figures, their heads ringed by an unearthly green halo from their flashlights. He turned again up into the cave, followed by the others. With every yard, their excitement increased. This was a passage exactly as John had predicted, but would it just end in a blank wall? Now, there is a diagram at the bottom of this story. Let me show you. There. So, I think this is the cave, or this is the entrance to the cave here. This is the loch, and this is the top of the land. This is the sheer rock face. Right, so let's carry on with the story. We have some pictures. On they went, able to see miraculously, it seems to be getting brighter. They all peered upwards, and sure enough, the dense black was giving way to clearer water. Far above them, there appeared to be a faint greenish yellow glow. They surfaced to find themselves near one of the banks of a large circular lake, perhaps a mile or so in diameter. Making for the side, they climbed eagerly onto the rocky shelf bordering the water and scrambled to their feet. The air was very still and hot, the atmosphere wet and humid. Above them shone an eerie, phosphorescent light. They gazed in wonder at the scene before them. It was Alan who voiced all their thoughts. Almost to himself he whispered in an awed voice, "A lost world." "Yes," said John slowly, "and we've found it." The professor was looking raptly around him. Tree ferns, cyads, ginkgos, horsetails. This forest is 100 million years old. Price's voice brought them back to reality with a jerk. "Gee, this is fantastic. Wait until the press gets hold of it. We'll be as famous as if we had hit the moon." John turned on him angrily. "No one is telling the press. Not yet, at any rate. What's more, no one is going back till I say so." While they had been talking, they had become aware of a low, confused hum or murmur, which did not seem to come from any particular direction. They listened. "What is it, Professor?" asked John. The professor thought for a moment or two. Then he said, "Insects. Millions of them, and perhaps also all manner of creatures known only to us fossil relics. We are listening to jungle sounds as they must have been on Earth millions upon millions of years ago." "Let's go back," said Price. "If there are million-year-old insects, there are million-year-old monsters, and by crikey, I don't want to meet up with one." The professor eyed him with contempt. "Go back if you like," he said, "but we're going in." They took off their diving suits. Alan had been examining the phosphorescent light, which seemed to come from a roof about 500 feet above them. "How do you explain that light, Professor?" he asked. "I don't, Alan. Radioactivity, or the roof of the cavern, could be encrusted with billions of phosphorescent creatures which appeared relatively early in the Earth's history." The four set out into the eerie forest. The soil was black and spongy. Occasionally there were clusters of gloriously coloured flowers. The professor was beside himself with excitement. His voice had gone up another octave. "These flowers," he explained, "were probably the earliest to appear on Earth. Some of them resemble the modern lotus, except that they are much larger and their petals a delicate shade of blue. Other flowers they instantly recognised as dogweed and magnolia. As they went on, the swarms of bees and flies became more numerous, and odd-looking beetles and enormous spiders scurried over the ground. was half whisper, half sob. The tree moved itself deliberately. The others stirred into the forest, and there before their eyes they saw a great tree-like column swaying from side to side in a series of loathsome jerks. John put an instinctive protective arm around his brother, but the Professor, cautiously, yet otherwise unconcerned, was moving through the trees in the direction of the gruesome spectacle. He turned and came hurrying back to the others. "It's all right, it's all right," he called out. "It's nothing to be alarmed about. It's not a tree at all. It's the neck of some huge reptile with its head in a clump of foliage." "Heavens!" gasped John. "Hadn't we better run for it?" "Of course not." The Professor was completely composed. "This is a plant-eater, almost certainly a brachiosaurus. There were carnivorous dinosaurs, but this one would not be interested in us. In any case, it is buried up to its shoulders in a swamp, and as it weighs about 50 tons and has somewhat inadequate legs, it would be a very poor performer on dry land. What's more, it has got such a tiny brain that even if it saw us, it would take a considerable time to appreciate the fact. Oh no, we're safe enough." John was amazed by the Professor's sang-froid. He seemed to have blithely accepted the fact that they had to all intents and purposes gone back millions of years. "Unquestionably, our lost world resembles that which we call Mesozoic, which was in full swing 150 million years ago," went on the Professor. He added with some relish, "That means we are in the age of giant reptiles." "Look, Professor," broke in John, "I don't want to seem a spoilsport, but is this getting a bit dangerous? I know it all seems like a dream, and we're going to wake up at any moment, but that brachiosaurus was pretty real. If not a brachiosaurus, why not a megalosaurus or a tyrannosaurus? I shouldn't like your Alan to be a dinosaur's dinner." Price had been fidgeting while Alan spoke. As soon as he opened his mouth, it was obvious that he had lost his nerve. "I'm not going to be a dinosaur's dinner either. By crikey, I'm getting out now. This place is dangerous." His voice trailed off incoherently, and before anyone could stop him, he began to run back the way they had come, still shouting hysterically. "Better leave him," said the Professor. "He'll find his way back. That's the last time I ever take on anyone from Harvard. Anyway, I agree with you, John. I think we ought to be getting back." "Okay," said John, "but first, can we go and see what is over there?" He pointed to an area to their right where the trees thinned out rapidly and chinks of light showed between them. "By all means," replied the Professor. They pushed their way through the panoply of leaves and branches. Alan, who had scrambled ahead, called out, "I can see water through the trees." Soon they had emerged through the dense jungle of vegetation to find themselves standing on the edge of a large oval lake which could not have been less than 5 miles long. What they saw was the most fantastic sight ever witnessed by man. It was the scene of indescribable activity. The water was alive with movement. Great shoals of fishes swam just below the surface, accompanied by weirdly shaped reptiles scything through the water in a series of coils, like half-submerged rubber tires. Overhead, scores of creatures swooped and glided with beats of bat-like wings. They were not birds. Instead of beaks, they had elongated jaws with rows of formidable-looking teeth. The three were speechless. No word in the human vocabulary seemed resembling studded jewels and precious stones in a variety of greens, yellows and mauves. Floating on the surface were curious cup-shaped flowers with long stems, dangling deep into the water. The extraordinary thing about them was they seemed to be consciously swimming together in a shoal. The professor explained that these crinoids, as they were called, were classed as animals and not plants. They stood spellbound as prehistory unrolled itself before their incredulous eyes, but the spell was rudely broken. A terrible crashing noise had suddenly begun to fill the forest. It sounded as if a giant was bludgeoning his way towards them. Before they had time to be terrified, a colossal 20-foot-long animal exploded into view. Its body was arched in a great curve. Its small head was held low to the ground. It was covered with large, triangular bony plates. But it was not this hideously armoured apparition that was making the crashing noise. Something was coming behind it, something huge and terrible. Something that was making it flee. So let me show you this picture a little bit closer before we carry on. Then a 6-foot lizard-like animal raced in front of them. It stopped dead in its tracks and lay motionless. But just behind it towered the most hideous animal that has ever walked the face of the earth, a tyrannosaurus. It stood erect on enormously thick hind legs. It was about 20 feet high. Its stone-coloured, lizard-like body was crowned by a massive head from which protruded monstrous jaws armed with colossal dagger teeth. As repellent as its vast bulk were its tiny, almost deformed arms, no bigger than a child's, with only 2 stunted fingers. The 3 lay motionless by the lake, not daring to move, but unable to take their eyes off the terrible sight. The awful reptile moved its giant head slowly from side to side, seemingly oblivious of the terrified animal cowering beneath it. They could see its eyes scanning back and forth. Would it see them? Alan closed his eyes. Suddenly it made a swift plunge, dropped its head at astonishing speed, grasped the struggling reptile in its jaws and bore it off triumphantly into the forest. The 3 men lay very still. John's heart seemed to be going like a pneumatic drill. Then the professor, his voice hoarse and unnatural, said, "There could be hundreds of creatures like that. Farther into the forest. Let's get back as quickly as we can." They retraced their steps. The forest seemed deadly quiet now. After they had walked for about a quarter of an hour, the professor broke a silence with a nervous laugh. "Well, John, that was a zoology lesson you won't forget. Did you recognise the main actors?" The brute was a tyrannosaurus. The armour-plated thing was a stegosaurus, but I couldn't tell you what the unfortunate lizard was. That was a camptosaurus, and if you want to continue the lesson, on your right you can see the first true bird, the first animal to grow feathers, the Archaeopteryx. The professor pointed to a large, exquisite bird with brilliantly coloured feathers, eagle-like wings, and a great plume extended behind it. Much sooner than they expected, they saw they were nearing the lake. "I wonder where Price is," said Alan. "Probably back at the cottage, drinking my whisky," said the professor. "I suppose I can't very well sack him for refusing to face up to a tyrannosaurus." Suddenly, for the first time, they began to think of the world outside. Not far away, they knew the wind was whipping up the black waters of Loch Ness. John voiced all their thoughts scientists like Price. The others nodded. In another 5 minutes they had reached the edge of the lake. "Well, I hope our diving suits are still there," joked the Professor, "and they haven't become a dinosaur's dinner." His words trailed away. Lying by the lake, 25 yards from them was the body of Price, and above him reared a grotesque black neck emerging from a vast body and paddle-like limbs which lay in the shallows. There could be no doubt about it. It was a plesiosaur, the Loch Ness Monster itself. And it had seen them. Its fierce serpent eyes were fixed on them. It swayed its neck and writhed and wriggled menacingly in the water. "It's coming for us," yelled John. "Alan, your revolver. Shoot." Alan dragged the revolver from its holster. He fired once from the hip, then fired again with his arm extended. The second shot hit its mark right between the monster's eyes. The monster blinked, the swaying stopped, and there was a moment's silence. Then a great tail arched out of the water about 50 feet from the creature's head. It descended with a crash that sent water spraying high into the air. Then, as it rolled and threshed in the violence of its death throes, the lake became a cauldron of rumbling water and spray. Suddenly all was still. The monster lay motionless and dead, floating helplessly on the surface. It was dark when the 3 men arrived back at their cottage. They had been away little more than 12 hours, yet had seen things they would talk about with each other for the rest of their lives. The Professor's first move was to fill 3 glasses with whiskey. "I suppose," said John, "you might say we've solved the mystery of the Loch Ness Monster." "I would say even more," replied the Professor thoughtfully. "That may have been the last of the monsters. Those which entered into Loch Ness must have done so in a desperate search for food, and I'm sure they could not have survived in the cold water. So I would say, Alan, you probably have the rather doubtful distinction of killing the last of the plesiosaurs. I doubt whether we'll be reading very much about the Loch Ness Monster in our newspapers." The end. Well, that definitely wasn't a real story, was it? This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying, I shall see